I didn't violate my oath when I kept quiet. I violated it the moment I understood what my silence was being used for. Most people think secrets are locked away in vaults, buried under classification stamps and armed guards. That's not how it really works. The real lock is inside the people who were there. Inside the ones who learned early that asking the wrong question could end a career, or a life that still had to be lived afterward. My name is Richard J. Bennett. I served in the United States Air Force. That much exists on paper. What doesn't exist are the operations that filled the spaces between deployments, the orders that came without insignia, the briefings that ended before you could take notes. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't an analyst. I was there to execute, to secure, to transport, to forget. And for decades, I did exactly that. There's a popular belief that if the government recovered something non-human, would be chaos. Leaks. Panic. 1,000 people talking at once. The truth is quieter. Smaller. 4 men in a room. A locked door. A single folder slid across a metal table with no seal, no letterhead, no signatures at the bottom. The first time I saw that folder, it wasn't labeled alien or extraterrestrial. It was labeled Medical Summary, Recovery Site B. Clinical. Clean. Boring if you didn't know what it referred to. That was intentional. The body had already been removed when I arrived. I never saw the recovery itself. People like me usually don't. We see what comes after, what remains, what needs to be handled without ceremony. What I did see was the report prepared afterward. It didn't read like science fiction. That's what still bothers me. It read like any other medical document I'd seen during my service. Measurements, observations, internal notes written by professionals who were trying very hard not to react emotionally to what they were examining. No speculation, no wonder, just anatomy described by people trained to pretend nothing surprises them anymore. The language was restrained, almost aggressively so. Subject presents bilateral symmetry. Internal structures not consistent with known terrestrial species. Cause of death undetermined. No adjectives, no conclusions. At one point, I remember thinking the report was lying by omission. Not by falsifying data, but by refusing to interpret it. As if interpretation itself was the real threat. As if writing what it meant would make it impossible to control. I didn't ask who wrote the report. I didn't ask where the body was taken. Those questions weren't forbidden out loud, but they were discouraged in other ways, through looks, through silence, through the way conversations simply ended when someone leaned too far forward. That was the system. You learned it quickly, or you were removed from it. People imagine men like me as hardened, unshaken. That's another myth. The truth is, most of us felt the weight immediately. We just didn't have the language for it. You can't process something when you're trained to reduce everything to procedure. You just file it away, exactly the way they teach you to. Still, that report stayed with me. Not the diagrams, not the measurements, the absence of commentary. The deliberate refusal to say what every person in that room already understood, that this body did not belong to this world, and that acknowledging that fact would force questions no one was prepared to answer. I sometimes wonder if the report was written that way to protect us, or to trap us. Once you read it, once you signed that you'd seen it, you were bound to it. Not legally, psychologically. You couldn't unknow it, and you couldn't talk about it without becoming the problem yourself. That's when I learned something the public never gets told. The secret isn't in the files. The secret is in what those files do to the people who read them. And if that medical report was only the beginning, what exactly was it preparing us for next? There's something no one explains to you when you're handed a document like that. Once you see it, you start noticing the gaps everywhere else. After the report, nothing dramatic happened. No alarms, no speeches, no new orders that acknowledged what we had just been exposed to. That was deliberate. The system doesn't react loudly to something like that. It absorbs it. It isolates it. It waits for the shock to settle before it decides how much of you it's going to keep. I was instructed to remain on standby for follow-up tasks related to the recovery. That was the phrase used. Follow-up tasks. No mention of a body. No mention of remains. Just logistics. Just movement. What I didn't expect was to be allowed to see the report again, this time with annotations. Different handwriting, different ink, short notes in the margins that didn't correct the findings but questioned them quietly. Things like, structure resembles no known developmental anomaly. Cellular response inconsistent with hypoxia patterns. Muscle fiber density suggests non-terrestrial adaptation. Those words weren't meant for me. I knew that. I wasn't supposed to read them closely. But when a folder is left open in front of you, when no one tells you to stop reading, that's also a kind of order. The medical team never spoke in front of us. They spoke around us. Conversations lowered when we entered rooms. Sentences stopped halfway. It wasn't fear. It was discipline. The same discipline I had lived under my entire career, now applied to something that clearly didn't fit inside it. At some point, one of the doctors, an older man, civilian, looked at me longer than necessary. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression wasn't panic. It was resignation. The look of someone who understands that discovery doesn't always lead to truth. Sometimes it just leads to better containment. I remember thinking that whatever this body was, it had already failed at something. Not biologically, strategically. It had been found. And because it had been found, it was no longer evidence of anything. It was a liability. That's when I realized the report wasn't written to inform. It was written to limit damage. Every line was precise enough to be defensible, and vague enough to prevent interpretation. Anyone higher up the chain could read it and walk away saying, "We don't know what it is," while still understanding exactly what it wasn't. Human. People like to believe that proof changes things. That if a non-human body exists, history would split in two, before and after. That's not how institutions work. They don't split. They compress. They apply pressure until the anomaly fits into the existing shape, even if that shape has to warp to accommodate it. I followed orders. I always had. I transported sealed containers without manifests. I guarded rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. I stood watch over silence itself. And no one ever said, "You are guarding an alien body." They didn't have to. Silence was the confirmation. Years later, people would ask why no one spoke sooner, why men like me waited. They imagine fear of punishment, court-martial, prison. That's not the real reason. The real reason is simpler and harder to explain. Once you accept that the truth can be observed, documented, and still deliberately neutralized, you start to wonder what speaking would even accomplish. Because if a body can be reduced to a medical summary and quietly filed away, what chance does a witness ever really have? And if that report wasn't meant to reveal anything at all, why was it allowed to exist in the first place? There's a moment that comes after the shock fades. Not relief, not denial. Something quieter. Normalization. That's when it becomes dangerous. After the report, after the annotations, after the unspoken understanding settled into place, the environment adjusted. The guards rotated, the containers moved, the conversations shifted back to weather, schedules, routine grievances. The system did what it always does. It made the impossible familiar enough to ignore. That's how you survive it. I wasn't told to forget what I had read. No one ever gives that order. Forgetting is implied. You're given just enough distance, just enough repetition of normalcy that the extraordinary becomes something you carry privately, like an old injury that only hurts when the weather changes. But the body didn't leave me. Not visually, I barely saw it. Conceptually. The report described structures that had no evolutionary explanation, organs that didn't fail the way ours do. A nervous system organized differently, as if perception itself followed another logic. No trauma consistent with crash impact, no signs of prolonged survival after whatever brought it down. The implication was obvious but never stated. It hadn't died the way we die. I remember sitting alone one night, reading through a redacted copy I was no longer supposed to have access to. Entire sections blacked out, but the spacing still visible. You could tell how much had been removed by how much page remained. That's another trick. Even redaction communicates. The more they hid, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated event. The language referenced comparative data, baselines, prior assumptions adjusted. You don't adjust assumptions based on a single incident. That thought stayed with me longer than anything else. I had spent my career believing that ignorance was the default state, that discovery was rare, that secrecy existed because information was fragile. That night I understood something different. Secrecy exists because discovery is repeatable. No one panics over lightning once you've built a lightning rod. I started noticing how carefully my own reactions were being monitored. Not overtly, no interrogations, just subtle changes. Who I spoke to, where I was assigned, the kinds of tasks I was trusted with afterward. Silence is measured. Compliance is observed. I complied. I didn't push. I didn't ask. I didn't share my doubts even with people I trusted, especially not with them. Because once you voice it, it stops being a thought and becomes a liability. Years passed. Decades. The world outside kept arguing about whether any of this could even be possible. Movies exaggerated it. Theories cheapened it. Denials made it seem absurd. All of that helped. Noise is useful when you need to hide something plain. I lived a life. I aged. I watched technology advance just far enough to start brushing against questions we weren't supposed to ask yet. And every time I saw a debate flare up, about sightings, about disclosures, about whistleblowers, I felt the same dull pressure in my chest. Not fear, recognition. They were circling the truth without touching it. Because the truth wasn't exciting. It wasn't cinematic. It was administrative. It was documented, archived, and psychologically distributed among people who learned very early that understanding didn't grant authority. Only silence did. I sometimes ask myself what would have happened if that report had never been written, if the body had been destroyed immediately, if no one had tried to understand it at all. Maybe that would have been cleaner. But they didn't do that. They examined it. They measured it. They compared it. And then they buried the meaning, not the data. Which leaves me with a question I've carried for years and never asked out loud. If knowing was never meant to change anything, why were some of us allowed to know at all? There's a detail that still bothers me more than the body itself. No one ever amended the report. In the military, paperwork is alive. It gets revised, corrected, updated as new information comes in. Errors are flagged, assumptions are replaced, language evolves as certainty increases. That's how it's supposed to work. This one didn't. The medical summary remained frozen in its original form, clean, cautious, incomplete by design. The annotations never made it into an official revision. The blacked-out sections stayed blacked out. It was as if the document had reached a point where improving its accuracy would have made it too honest to survive. I understood then that the report wasn't a step toward disclosure. It was a containment tool, not for the public, for the people inside the system. Once a thing is written down in a controlled way, it can be referenced without being discussed. You can point to it without reopening it. You can say, "We looked into that," and mean it in the narrowest sense possible. The report created closure without resolution. That's the trick. I was never asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement specific to what I'd seen. I'd already signed dozens by then. They didn't need another one. What they needed was for me to internalize the boundaries myself, to understand, without being told, where my thinking was allowed to go and where it had to stop. And I did. For a long time, I told myself that maybe it was necessary, that maybe some truths are too disruptive, that maybe the public wasn't ready, that maybe I wasn't either. Those are comforting thoughts. They let you live with yourself. But comfort erodes with time. As I got older, I realized something I hadn't been trained to consider when I was younger. Institutions don't ask whether truth should be revealed. They ask whether it can be managed. And when they decide it can't, they don't destroy it. They distribute it thinly. A report here, a witness there. Fragments spread across people who never meet, never compare notes, never speak out of turn. That way, no one holds the whole thing, and no one feels entitled to speak for it. I don't know where the body is now. I don't know what they learned from it after I was no longer useful. I don't know how many similar reports exist, or how many were quietly deemed inconclusive and shelved beside mine. What I do know is this. The most important discovery wasn't biological. It was procedural. They learned that proof doesn't force disclosure, that evidence doesn't demand honesty, that even something not of this earth can be absorbed, neutralized, and made irrelevant through structure alone. I'm speaking now because time has changed the equation, not because I think this will expose anything, not because I believe it will force answers, but because silence only works when the people holding it still believe they're protecting something. I no longer believe that. I believe the medical report was accurate in every way that mattered, and incomplete in the one way that didn't. It described a body. It avoided the implication, and in doing so, it taught everyone involved how to live with a truth that never gets spoken. That kind of knowledge doesn't fade. It isolates. It settles into you. And once it does, you're left with a final, uncomfortable thought that never appears in any file. If the recovery of a non-human body was treated as a logistical problem, what else has already been processed the same way and quietly moved out of sight?